A humble woman was humiliated by a judge, and she gave him a lesson he will never forget. Eleanor Reed had never considered herself remarkable. At 58, she'd spent most of her life in the small town of Millfield, working as a librarian at the local public library. Her modest home, a small craftsman bungalow with fading blue paint, stood on Maple Street, where she tended a garden that was the quiet envy of her neighbors. Her husband, Thomas, had passed away 5 years ago, leaving her alone but not lonely, as the community had embraced her with the warmth that small towns sometimes offer to their most steadfast residents. "Morning, Ms. Eleanor," called Hamey, the teenage boy who delivered newspapers on his bicycle before school. "Garden's looking mighty fine today." Eleanor smiled and waved, looking up from where she was pruning her prized roses. "Thank you, Hamey. Your mom still coming by for book club on Thursday?" The morning sun cast long shadows across Eleanor's front yard as she finished her gardening. Despite the arthritis that made her fingers ache in the cool morning air, she found peace in nurturing things that grew. It was a metaphor for her life's work, cultivating knowledge and curiosity in generations of Millfield's children at the library. Later that morning, Eleanor walked the 6 blocks to the library, greeting familiar faces along the way. The red brick building had been her second home for nearly 30 years, and she knew every creaking floorboard and dusty corner. "We've got a busy day ahead," said Marlene, her younger colleague. "The 3rd grade class from Washington Elementary is coming in for their monthly visit, and Judge Harmon's clerk called to reserve the conference room for tomorrow." Eleanor nodded, tension creeping into her shoulders at the mention of Judge Richard Harmon. He was new to Millfield, having moved from Chicago 2 years ago when he was appointed to the county circuit court. His reputation for harsh sentences and unforgiving demeanor had preceded him. "And don't forget," Marlene added, lowering her voice, "the budget meeting with the town council is this afternoon. They're talking about cuts again." As Eleanor organized books for the children's visit, her mind wandered to the budget meeting. The library had been struggling for years, and with each passing budget cycle, their funding dwindled. She had drafted a passionate plea for additional resources, statistics meticulously gathered to support her case. The library wasn't just a building with books, it was the heart of Millfield, a sanctuary for knowledge and community gathering. That afternoon, Eleanor stood before the town council in the municipal building's meeting room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the room smelled of coffee and furniture polish. "As you can see from the data I've provided," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her nervousness, "our library serves over 70% of Millfield's residents. We offer essential services beyond books, computer access for job seekers, after-school programs for children, and community spaces for local groups." She noticed Judge Harmon at the end of the council table, invited as a courtesy due to his position. His eyes were on his phone, clearly disinterested in her presentation. Eleanor continued undeterred, her passion for the library evident in every word. Little did Eleanor know that this budget meeting would set in motion events that would change her life and the life of Judge Harmon in ways neither could imagine. The following week, Eleanor found herself sitting on a hard wooden bench outside Courtroom C in the Millfield County Courthouse. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her best navy dress, the one she reserved for special occasions and funerals. This was neither, yet somehow felt more momentous. 3 days earlier, she had received a citation for a broken taillight and failure to provide proof of insurance during a routine traffic stop. The taillight had been knocked out when a neighborhood kid's baseball went astray, and her insurance card was simply sitting in her other purse. Simple mistakes with simple solutions, or so she thought. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Richard Harmon presiding, announced the bailiff as the side door opened and Judge Harmon swept in, black robes billowing behind him. Eleanor observed him closely, mid-60s, with steel-gray hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to authority. His reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he settled into his chair and began shuffling through the day's docket. First case, Eleanor Reed, violation of Traffic Code Sections 42.3 and 18.7, called the clerk. Eleanor approached the defendant's table with small, careful steps. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she maintained her composure. She had never been in trouble with the law before. "Miss Reed," Judge Harmon said, without looking up from his papers, "you're charged with operating a vehicle with defective equipment and failure to provide proof of insurance. How do you plead?" "I'd like to explain, Your Honor," Eleanor began. "The taillight was—" "That wasn't my question," Judge Harmon interrupted sharply, finally looking up at her with cold eyes. "I asked how you plead. Guilty or not guilty?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "Technically guilty, Your Honor, but there are extenuating circumstances that—" "Save it," he cut her off again. "This court doesn't have time for excuses. The law is clear." The young prosecutor stepped forward. "Your Honor, Miss Reed has no prior violations in her driving record. We recommend the standard fine of $150 for the equipment violation and $200 for the insurance violation." Judge Harmon's gaze swept over Eleanor, taking in her modest dress and nervous demeanor. Something in his expression hardened. "Ms. Reed, you work at the public library, correct?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor, for 30 years now," she replied, a note of pride in her voice. "Ah, yes, I remember you from the budget meeting, the one who thinks books are more important than public safety," he said dismissively. "Perhaps if you spent less time with fictional stories and more time maintaining your vehicle and paperwork, you wouldn't be wasting this court's time today." A few snickers rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor's face flushed with heat. The judge continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've had your position for 30 years, yet you can't be bothered to follow basic traffic laws that every 16-year-old with a learner's permit understands." He peered at her over his reading glasses. "I find that people in your position, comfortable in their routines, believing the rules don't apply to them, need a more meaningful reminder of their civic responsibilities." He banged his gavel. "I'm imposing a fine of $300 for the equipment violation and $400 for the insurance violation. Additionally, you will complete 40 hours of community service with the County Roadside Cleanup Program." Gasps echoed around the courtroom. Even the prosecutor looked surprised by the severity of the sentence. "Your Honor," Eleanor finally found her voice, "I brought my insurance card today, and I've already fixed the taillight. I can show you the receipt from—" "Are you questioning my ruling, Ms. Reed?" Judge Harmon's voice cut like ice. Eleanor stood frozen, her dignity stripped away in front of a room full of strangers. "No, Your Honor," she whispered. "Good. Next case," he called, already looking past her. As Eleanor gathered her purse with trembling hands and walked out of the courtroom, she felt something shift inside her. The humiliation burned, but beneath it, a resolution was forming, not for revenge, but for justice of a different kind. "He did what?" Marlene's voice rose in indignation as Eleanor recounted her courtroom experience the following day. They were shelving books in the reference section. The library quiet in the mid-morning lull. "Shh," Eleanor cautioned, though no patrons were nearby. "It's fine. I'll pay the fines and do the community service." "It's not fine, Eleanor. He humiliated you publicly for no reason. And those fines, that's almost a week's pay for you." Eleanor slid a weathered copy of To Kill a Mockingbird into place, her fingers lingering on the spine. "What choice do I have? He's a judge. That doesn't give him the right to treat people like dirt," Marlene insisted. "Remember Mrs. Gonzalez from the community garden? Her son got 6 months for a first-time possession charge. Just marijuana. Not even a full ounce. Everyone said it should have been probation." Eleanor nodded, recalling other stories she'd heard around town about Judge Harmon's harsh sentences and courtroom demeanor. It wasn't just her. He seemed to reserve special contempt for working-class people, immigrants, and anyone he deemed beneath him. That evening, as Eleanor picked up litter along County Road 27, in her mandated orange vest, the autumn sun beat down on her back. Her knees ached from bending to retrieve discarded fast food wrappers and cigarette butts. 2 hours down, 38 to go. "Ms. "Eleanor? That you?" A familiar voice called. Eleanor straightened, wincing at the pain in her lower back, to see Ray Thompson pulling his pickup truck to the shoulder. Ray had been the custodian at the library for decades before retiring last year. "Ray, how are you?" she asked, trying to sound cheerful despite her embarrassment at being seen in the orange vest. "What in heaven's name are you doing out here?" he asked, getting out of his truck. When Eleanor explained, Ray's weathered face darkened. "Harmon," he spat. "That man's been a thorn in this county's side since he arrived. My nephew got before him last year, driving with a suspended license. Needed the car to get to his job at the hospital. Harmon gave him 30 days, cost him his job." Ray insisted on driving Eleanor home. As they rode in his truck, Eleanor listened to more stories about Judge Harmon, how he'd foreclosed on the Williams family farm without allowing them the extension other judges might have granted, how he'd thrown a young mother in jail for contempt when her baby started crying in his courtroom. Someone ought to teach that man a lesson, Ray concluded as he pulled up to Eleanor's house. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat on her porch swing, wrapped in a quilt despite the mild evening. Judge Harmon's words played on repeat in her mind. People in your position, believing the rules don't apply to them. But it was more than her personal humiliation that kept her awake. It was the pattern she saw emerging, a justice system that wasn't just a man with power using it to punish rather than protect. Eleanor Reed had spent her life believing in systems, that libraries preserved knowledge for everyone equally, that laws protected all citizens fairly. Now, at 58, she was confronting the reality that systems were only as good as the people who ran them. As she rocked gently, watching fireflies blink in her garden, an idea began to form. Not revenge. Eleanor wasn't wired that way, but perhaps education. Perhaps Judge Richard Harmon needed to learn something that law school had failed to teach him. She went inside and pulled out a notebook, beginning to write. By the time the first birds began their morning songs, Eleanor had filled several pages. She finally fell asleep with the notebook on her chest. A plan taking shape that would require all her librarian's skills of research, patience, and understanding of human nature. The next morning, Eleanor called in sick for the first time in 5 years. She had work to do, important work that couldn't wait. Judge Harmon's lesson was about to begin. The Millfield County Historical Society occupied a Victorian house on Elm Street, its rooms filled with artifacts and documents chronicling the town's 175-year history. Eleanor had volunteered there on weekends for years, helping to catalog and preserve local records. "Back so soon, Eleanor?" asked Herbert Jenkins, the Society's elderly president, as she entered the building early Saturday morning. "I thought you were working on the library's anniversary exhibition." "Change of plans," Eleanor replied, hanging her cardigan on the coat rack. "I'm researching the county's judicial history, particularly the last 20 years or so." Herbert raised his bushy eyebrows but asked no further question. Eleanor had earned her reputation for thoroughness and discretion. For hours, she pored over newspaper archives, court records, and town meeting minutes. She created a timeline of Richard Harmon's career, from his early days as a corporate attorney in Chicago to his appointment to the circuit court. She noted patterns in his rulings, controversies that had been quickly buried, connections to influential people. "Find what you were looking for?" Herbert asked as closing time approached. Eleanor gathered her notes. "Just beginning, I'm afraid." The next phase of her research took her to the county clerk's office, the law library at the community college, and even to Chicago, where she spent 2 days of her vacation time visiting courthouses and newspaper archives. She spoke to former colleagues of Judge Harmon, litigants who had appeared before him, and courthouse staff who observed him daily. What emerged was a complex portrait. Richard Harmon had once been an idealistic young attorney, passionate about corporate accountability. Something had changed 15 years ago. A case gone wrong, a personal tragedy. Details varied, but the result was clear. The man had hardened, his empathy replaced by rigid adherence to rules and hierarchy. 3 weeks into her research, Eleanor received an unexpected opportunity. The library was hosting a legal education series, and Judge Harmon had agreed to speak about the judicial system, a public relations effort suggested by the county after complaints about his courtroom manner. "You'll introduce him, of course," said Marlene, who had organized the event. As head librarian, Eleanor nodded, a plan crystallizing in her mind. The evening of the event, the library's community room was filled to capacity. Eleanor stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of her neighbors and friends. Judge Harmon sat to her right, his expression impassive. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The Millfield Public Library is honored to welcome Judge Richard Harmon as part of our Know Your Legal System series." She paused, looking directly at the judge. "Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to share a story that highlights why understanding our judicial system is so important." Eleanor recounted the story of Martin Reynolds, a local farmer who had lost his property in a foreclosure overseen by Judge Harmon 3 years earlier. She described how Reynolds had fallen behind on payments after medical bills depleted his savings when his wife was diagnosed with cancer. "What many don't know," Eleanor continued, "is that Mr. Reynolds had qualified for a hardship extension under County Ordinance 47, BE, which Judge Harmon chose not to apply." She saw Harmon shift uncomfortably in his seat. Eleanor then spoke about Lisa Martinez, the young mother who was held in contempt when her baby cried in court, resulting in her losing custody temporarily while serving 3 days in jail. Miss Martinez didn't have childcare that day because the courthouse daycare program, mandated by state law for all county facilities, had been deemed unnecessary in a budget hearing where Judge Harmon cast the deciding vote as judicial representative. One by one, Eleanor presented cases, not with anger or accusation, but with meticulous detail and context. She connected Judge Harmon's rulings to their real-world impacts on the community he served. She cited laws and precedents that had been overlooked or ignored. When she finally introduced the judge, the room was utterly silent. Judge Harmon approached the podium, his face flushed, his hands gripping his prepared remarks. Eleanor took her seat, her heart pounding but her conscience clear. This was not humiliation for humiliation's sake. This was accountability, a mirror held up to reflect the true face of justice in Millfield County. The lesson had begun. Judge Harmon cleared his throat as he adjusted the microphone. The silence in the library's community room was deafening. "Thank you, Ms. Reed, for that comprehensive introduction," he began, his voice tight. He glanced down at his prepared speech about the nobility of the American justice system, then set it aside. "I had planned to speak about judicial procedure tonight, but perhaps it's more appropriate to address some of the cases that have been mentioned." Eleanor watched him carefully from her seat in the front row. She hadn't expected him to deviate from his script. "The law," Judge Harmon continued, "is not designed to be flexible. It exists precisely because human emotions and circumstances are so variable. Without firm rules and consistent application, we risk a system based on favoritism rather than fairness." He looked directly at Eleanor. "Mrs. Reed suggests that I've been unnecessarily harsh. I would argue that I've been necessarily consistent." The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Harmon proceeded to defend his rulings, citing statutes and judicial philosophy. He was eloquent and composed, every inch the experienced jurist. But Eleanor noticed something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. When the formal presentation ended and the floor opened for questions, Maria Gonzalez, whose son had received the harsh sentence for marijuana possession, stood up. "Judge Harmon, my son made a mistake. One mistake. He lost his scholarship, his place at the university, and now has a record that follows him everywhere. How is this justice?" Before the judge could respond, Robert Williams, the farmer who had lost his land, spoke up from the back. "My family farmed that land for 3 generations. I asked for 90 days, just 90 days, to catch up on payments after my wife's cancer treatments. The bank was willing. You weren't. One by one, community members rose to speak, not shouting, not accusing, but sharing stories of how Judge Harmon's rulings had affected their lives. Eleanor remained silent. This wasn't part of her plan, but she recognized it as perhaps the most powerful lesson of all. Judge Harmon listened, his expression growing more troubled with each story. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its authoritative edge. "I appreciate your perspectives," he said carefully. "The view from the bench is necessarily different from the view from your seats. I'm tasked with upholding the law as written, not as we might wish it to be." Eleanor finally stood. "With respect, Your Honor, the law is more than words on paper. It's a living covenant between citizens and their government. When we forget the humanity behind each case, we're no longer serving justice. We're simply processing paperwork." The judge's eyes locked with hers. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginnings of understanding. After the event, Eleanor found Judge Harmon standing alone near the refreshment table, a cup of untouched coffee in his hand. "Ms. Reed," he acknowledged her with a nod. "That was quite an introduction." "It wasn't meant to embarrass you," she said quietly. "It was meant to show you something you might not see from the bench." He studied her face. "Todd, you researched all those cases personally." Eleanor nodded. "I also found some interesting things about your early career. You once argued passionately for leniency for a corporate whistleblower who'd technically violated his employment contract but had exposed dangerous safety violations." Surprise flickered across his face. "That was a long time ago." "Not so long that it can't be remembered," Eleanor replied. She reached into her bag and handed him a folder. "Seat, this is for you. News clipping, transcripts of your early cases, excerpts from papers you wrote in law school about judicial compassion." Judge Harmon took the folder, his expression unreadable. "You put me on roadside cleanup duty," Eleanor said, a small smile playing at her lips. "I found more than trash out there. I found stories, dozens of them, about the impact you've had on this community since you arrived. I'm just sorry they weren't happier ones." She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "Ms. Reed, Eleanor, why go to all this trouble? Why not just complain to the Judicial Review Board or write an angry letter to the newspaper?" Eleanor looked back at him. "Because I'm a librarian, Judge Harmon. I believe in the power of information, context, and understanding. And I believe people can change when they're presented with the full story." She left him standing there, the folder clutched in his hands as she went to help Marlene clean up after the event. The lesson had been delivered. Whether it would be received remained to be seen. 6 months passed. Eleanor continued her work at the library, her community service long completed. The incident in Judge Harmon's courtroom had faded from local gossip, replaced by newer dramas in the small town. One rainy Tuesday morning, Eleanor was surprised to find an official envelope from the county courthouse in her mail. Inside was a formal notice for a hearing regarding reassessment of penalties in the matter of Eleanor Reed, case CR 2023-714. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Was Judge Harmon retaliating for her public education campaign? Had she crossed a line with her research and presentation? That Friday, she once again found herself sitting on the hard wooden bench outside courtroom CE, wearing the same navy dress. This time, however, she held her head high. Whatever came next, she would face it with dignity. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Harmon," the bailiff announced. The judge entered, but something was different. His usual imperious stride had been replaced by a more measured pace. He nodded to the courtroom before taking his seat. "First and only case today, reassessment of penalties, Eleanor Reed," called the clerk. Eleanor approached the defendant's table, surprised to see no prosecutor present. "Ms. Reed," Judge Harmon began, "thank you for coming today. I've called this special hearing to address the penalties imposed in your traffic violation case earlier this year." He removed his reading glasses and met her gaze directly. "After careful review, I've determined that the penalties were disproportionate to the infraction. The additional community service hours are hereby canceled, and the excess fines, $300 beyond standard penalties will be refunded to you." Murmurs rippled through the small audience. Eleanor stood perfectly still, uncertain how to respond. "Vitus, furthermore," the judge continued, "I want to acknowledge publicly that my conduct during your hearing was inappropriate and unprofessional. Personal biases and preconceptions have no place in a courtroom. For that, I offer my sincere apology." The courtroom fell silent. Eleanor found her voice. "Thank you, Your Honor. I accept your apology." Judge Harmon nodded, then surprised everyone by continuing, "Ms. Reed's case has prompted me to review several other rulings where penalties may have been excessive. A list of those cases will be published, and affected parties will be notified of reconsideration hearings." He cleared his throat. "Additionally, I've been working with the county commissioners to reinstate the courthouse child care program and to establish a hardship review process for foreclosure cases." Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise. These were substantial changes, systemic improvements that would benefit the entire community. "This court is adjourned," Judge Harmon announced, rising from the bench. As people filed out, Eleanor remained, watching the judge gather his papers. He noticed her and approached the railing that separated them. "I read everything in that folder you gave me," he said quietly. "And then I pulled my old case files, law school papers, things I hadn't looked at in years." Eleanor nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot why I became a judge in the first place. After my wife died, He paused, searching for words. "I think I stopped seeing people and started seeing only infractions and statutes. It's never too late to start seeing people again," Eleanor said gently. Judge Harmon extended his hand across the railing. "The library is hosting another legal education series next month. I've been told the topic is compassion in the justice system. Would you consider co-presenting with me? I think we might have complementary perspective." Eleanor smiled and shook his hand. "I'd be honored, Your Honor." As she walked home through the streets of Millfield, Eleanor reflected on the unexpected outcome of her lesson. She had hoped, at best, to make Judge Harmon reconsider his approach to justice. Instead, she had sparked something more profound, a return to the principles that had first led him to the law. That evening, as Eleanor tended her garden in the fading light, Jaime rode by on his bicycle, tossing the evening paper onto her porch. "Big news today, Ms. Eleanor," he called. "Judge Harmon's starting some new program at the courthouse for people who can't afford lawyers. Mom says you had something to do with it." Eleanor smiled and waved. "Sometimes, people just need a little reminder of who they really are, Jaime." As darkness fell over Millfield, Eleanor sat on her porch swing, newspaper in hand. The headline read, "Local judge announces reforms. Justice must see the person, not just the case." Below was a photograph of Judge Harmon standing on the courthouse steps, looking more at peace than she had ever seen him. The humble librarian had accomplished what no judicial review board or formal complaint could have. She had reconnected a lost soul with his original purpose, not through humiliation or revenge, but through the simple power of truth, context, and human connection. In the end, the lesson wasn't just for Judge Harmon. It was for everyone in Millfield, a reminder that true justice requires both the letter of the law and the spirit of compassion, and that even the quietest voice can change a system when armed with knowledge and determination. Eleanor Reed had never considered herself remarkable, but as she rocked gently on her porch swing, watching fireflies blink in her garden, she felt a quiet pride in knowing that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the humblest people.